So we're on. Can you guys at home hear me? Ashley, Reagan, Natalie, Julia, you're here. Good. I wanted to make sure.
We can hear you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'll take that as a no. Say what? Yeah, they're on mute. Yeah. Yes, we can. Okay, well, Julia, I'll take that as a yes. Good. I can't hear you. Yeah, we would have to ask you to unmute.
Hello.
Reagan,
Hello.
I really can't hear you. Well, guys, if you need, I'll keep an eye on the chat. But Reagan, you are so correct. I can't hear you guys. All right, so today we're turning the corner here. 1900 to 1945, modernism, and it's kind of an extension, really, of some of the things that were happening late in the 19th century, especially in France. And so that's why I asked the question on quiz 4 to kind of show you or have you show me that although this is kind of a group that we talk about as a movement, what they did, how it looks, their goals, their subject matter, everything is different from one artist to the next. And that kind of happens a lot in the 20th century, but we will get into some movements. Picasso, Cubism, and I think it's, how should I say this? It's probably not an accident that the writers of this text put Picasso at the front of the line when we talk about 20th century art. I want to give you a little bit of background on him, and that is that he is a Spaniard. He was born in Spain. He was like a child prodigy. There are these drawings from his childhood that are magnificent. He could draw and make art actually real well from a young age. His parents were art teachers. But because he was interested in art, he went to where the center of artistic and much intellectual activity was, Paris. And so this is 1905. He was born, I believe, in 1889, so 11. This is when he's still a young man. And this is a family of saltimbanques. And saltimbanques are circus workers. You can see dressed up in sort of a clown outfit. Here is probably a trapeze artist and so on. Traveling circus, and he's taken some of his cues from the people that came before him, especially in France. We started this whole modernist idea with Courbet. and the Stonebreakers. And why would you ever make a painting about two guys in tattered clothes breaking rocks? Well, this is kind of in that same vein. And in fact, circus people were kind of seen as low life. They were vagabonds. They kind of went from place to place, made a little money. Sometimes they were grifters and so on, but they didn't hold a very high place of esteem in the culture. And so he paints them. And I want to point this out too. Look at the brushwork and stuff. That's right out of Impressionism. The idea that you make a painting and you clearly leave the brushwork visible. And so this is called his Rose period. And Picasso becomes so famous, we start to break up his career into various periods. And he painted for a long time. I believe he died in like 1972. So he has a long and a very productive life. And he, unlike some of these people we've seen, he was actually famous in his own time. And so this is his Rose period. And he was kind of picking up on the ideas being floated around in Paris at the time. Pablo Picasso, Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was an American living in Paris. And she was herself an intellectual, but she was a person who was like right in the middle of all of this intellectual and artistic activity. She had this apartment right inside Paris, and people would come over. She'd throw parties for them. She was interested in literature and painting, philosophy, and so on. And so she was like kind of a big deal. And Picasso paints her portrait. And by this time, he's starting to see some of the other things going on in Paris at the time. And so this is kind of this kind of shows us where he's going to go. And take a look at those eyes. They're kind of like geometric. And the overall appearance of this is kind of flat. It's not entirely flat, but it's sort of flat. Picasso, and his confidant, his collaborator, a guy named George Braque, they started to get very interested in Cézanne. The idea of undisguised brushwork and flatness. And so here's Gertrude Stein, and here she is. I just pulled this up. Was an American novelist, poet, playwright, and art collector, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the Allegheny West neighborhood, raised in Oakland, California. Stein moved to Paris in 1903 and made France her home for the remainder of his life. She hosted a Paris salon, that's what I was talking about, where the leading figures of modernism in literature and art, such as Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis, Ezra Pound, Sherwood Anderson, Henri Matisse would meet. And this is what she looked like with a photograph is saying. That's her. And so if you could make the cut and you were an intellectual and you were an artist, Gertrude Stein was the person you'd want to know. And she would want to know you too, by the way. And so here's what he looked like. Pablo. Photo in his studio. Ravignan, Paris, 1908. And you can see here, was kind of why I like this photo a lot. Is this. He's starting to collect artwork. And because Paris was his place that was really shopping, if you will, that was a place where I showed you where the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were being exposed to art from around the world. And we saw the influence of Japanese art, especially prints, on what the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists did. We're starting to see artwork come from other places, and especially from Africa. And so he's exposed to this. We don't really know. We see here, this is a doll of some sort, probably not from Africa, probably from one of the Baltic countries or Russia or something. Bottom line, he's looking at all of this stuff from all over the world, and he's reconsidering art, reconsidering visual expression. And so this is like kind of considered one of his first great works of art, and it is the beginning of Cubism. This is at the Museum of Modern Art. It's actually quite large. You see it's 8 feet high by 7 feet 8 inches wide. It's also in my dining room at home. I got a poster of this. Actually, I love Picasso. I got Guernica too, by the way. I'll take pictures of them and bring them in next time. Bottom line, love Picasso. He was like, he does for art what Elvis and the Beatles did for rock and roll music. Or you might say what somebody like Dr. Dre did for hip hop. You know, the people that kind of changed the whole game. And so Picasso is at that megastar level. Demoiselles of Avignon. And there's a lot of talk over the century about what all of this means. And you can see here, let me zoom in on a couple of parts of this. There are people that talk about this space being influenced or inspired by African art. And if you kind of see how geometricized this space is, you can see where they would get that idea. And likewise, over here, something akin to, but not a copy of, African mask. And in some cultures, Africa among them, mask making is a form of art. It's not just Africa. The Chinese and the Japanese really were into making masks too. And they were considered to be part of ritual, religious ritual, and sometimes theater, performance art, and religion, and so on. But anyway, and what he's done here, if I could analyze this on a formal level, he's kind of flattened everything out, as I've been kind of pointing to. Second thing he's done is kind of geometricized all of the shapes. They're not perfect geometry. But he breaks things up into various shapes. That's why they call this stuff cubism, by the way. And cubism never was about cubes, but it was about taking the shapes of things and breaking them apart and flattening them out. And so cubism is like impressionism. It's kind of a misunderstanding of what the artists were doing, but they created this name and it stuck. And so that's one level of talking about this work. Dalmansels of Avignon, what he's painting here is a brothel. So that's kind of another layer of content that's put on this. And we can kind of see some of that happening. I showed you the Salton Banks, where they're taking people who don't really have a high esteemed place in society and culture and making art, making them the subject of their art. Well, we saw that 50 years prior to this. Manet, Olympia, the woman that is there, that's sort of the something of a copy of a Titian painting from the 16th century, was herself a madame, one of the highly popular and well-known madames of Paris at the time. So anyway, that kind of streak of that aspect of realism seemed to be something that a lot of these artists were drawn to. And if I could allow me, how about the Van Gogh potato eaters? A bunch of poor coal miners sitting around a table that's basically lit by oil lamps, and they don't have much to eat, and they're kind of grubby, and they've been working hard all day. They don't have any creature comforts. They are just maintaining a sustenance lifestyle. And again, not this esteemed place in the overall society, but kind of the people on the lower rungs, if you want to look at society as being stratified that way. And so that's going on too. And I want to 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see who's all here. I got Randus is here. Good. I'm telling you, I'm checking. And no chat's good. Another way to look at this, and because this has been around so long and it's kind of seen as one of the most important works in modernism, there's been another critique applied to this work, and that is a feminist critique. And there are a lot of people that's analyzed this work and said, this is Picasso's hostility towards women. And, you know, you can see it doesn't particularly paint these women in a flattering sort of way. And part of that critique shows this slice of melon here that looks as much like a sharp knife as it does a slice of melon. And the grapes, they've been likened to the idea of the castrating female. And so anyway, when I go down the feminist art critique, they don't pull any punches, but you can see it, I think. And a lot of Picasso's work will get analyzed through these same kind of constructs or frameworks, if you will. Formal, influenced by other cultures, hostility towards women, etc. And so there's that guy I was talking about, George Brock. What they do for a few years, they work together. George Brock, Pablo Picasso, they meet up and they take this idea of fracturing images and putting them back together on a flat surface to a new level. This is called the Portuguese. And basically, if you take a close look at some of this, you'll see these little fragments of images, but never a whole image. Anybody recognize where I have my little hand right here? Pling, bling. I'm playing the guitar, that's what that is. Yeah, kind of see it. What you see oftentimes on these, a profile of a face, kind of. You got to really look hard and you got to suspend your disbelief, but these things are there and that's what they base the work on. You can see here clearly some stencil letters and numbers, and they kind of like that as subject matter too, because basically they're flat and it fit right in with their ideas about flatness and fragmentation. And so another thing that they do, both of them at this time, is that they make these achromatic, which means they don't use color. We say, well, hey, Bohack, there's color here, there's white, there's black, there's browns. Are those colors? What do you think, Dave? Achromatic, these are considered to be achromatic, which means that they have no color. Would you agree with that statement? Disagree.
Yeah, that's like obviously in this whole piece of art, I can see like a lot of the
Yeah, there's some oranges and some yellows in there, absolutely.
yeah, mostly like bright colors.
Uh-huh. Well, that's true. Mackenzie, I saw you shaking your head. Yeah, see, I think what we're talking about here is a difference between then and now and what they consider color to be. And so for somebody like Seurat, who did the pointillism Sunday afternoon on the Isle of La Granjate, got my mask on, tripping over my mouth. He would say that colors are various points on the color wheel, which go from infrared to ultraviolet. Take that color wheel and put it in a linear format. Everything on there is the visible spectrum, and what you don't have on that visible spectrum are browns or black. And they would say that the browns are neutrals and the blacks and the whites, for that matter, are values. So anyway, I'm throwing this out there, and I think that in today's way of looking at color, we would say there is color here. And especially when you're pointing out, David, like, and Mackenzie, that there are some yellows and oranges in there. So anyway, but you'll run across that. And whether or not you agree that these are achromatic, what you can see is that they de-emphasize the role of color in their compositions. Now, there's going to be a lot of artists we'll see here soon that bring color back in a pretty major way, but for right here, here's a Picasso, still life with chair caning, and you see that? That's caning from a chair. They don't make them like that so much anymore, but you can still find them. And what it is this this stuff. It's like wicker or something. It's woven. It's organic threads, kind of like little twigs, if you will, and they're woven together. And it was kind of a big deal back in the day, back 100 some years ago. Cane chairs were everything. Why would that be? Well, they didn't have air conditioning, and on a hot day, if you had a caned chair, it would breathe and you would not get so hot and uncomfortable. And so anyway, he's taken that out and he's glued this onto the surface, and he's put a rope around the side. And again, some of those letters and stuff that I was talking about, they love that. And this is part of the word jour, J-O-U-R, which means the day. Bonjour, good day. Keep track of your days in a journal, J-O-U-R-N-A-L. Anyway, that's the root word. They like that. And so aside from actually going out and gluing in or collaging on actual things, actual materials, they were actually, in some of these works, would take newspapers and glue them onto the surface too. Like I say, they were real fond of the printed word, and a newspaper was everything. So they started using various materials, but the idea persists. Fragments of things, black, brown, achromatic, and the collage element. So this is sort of the evolution. And by the way, this is called analytic cubism. There's going to be a shift here shortly, and that will go to, oh, here's some more of that analytic cubism. They'll add color back in, and that'll be called synthetic cubism. But I want to show you this. This is a drawing, charcoal and various papers. And again, like I said, they like the newspapers because, and they liked them in fragments. They could get a fragment and was kind of doing in some respects what they were doing with their subject matter, breaking it up into fragments, and then you look at it, get little tiny bits of information, not the whole picture. And so bottle, newspaper, and pipe. And you can see the pipe, and that's drawn over the top of the newspaper. There's the bottle. You can see half of it over here and the line on this side. Newspaper's there too. It's just in fragments. George Braque, Picasso, early Cubism. Here's a maquette. Anybody know what a maquette is?
Yeah, I think the correct definition is like sculpture that
That is the exact definition. Absolutely, good job. Yeah, and so if you ever had the opportunity to work as a sculptor or work for a sculptor, a lot of times they produce maquettes scaled down. And in this case, it's cardboard and string wire. But it is a maquette for something that would have probably been made out of sheets of brass or steel, cut up, welded, and so on. Never happened. Never made it, just, but the maquette for guitar, and you see what he's done. He's taken the shape of a guitar, taken it all apart, and put it back together in fragments. And that's cubism. That's how it works. That's what they did. And so, you know what the criticism was? It doesn't look real. This is fake. Picasso was a very witty sort of artist. He talked about that. He said, all of this art before this time had been trompe l'oeil, the idea of fooling the eye. And we've talked about that. They spent 450 years developing that illusion of the subject matter. And he said that was a lie. In fact, he was very adamant. All art is a lie. I am bringing some truth to this. You can see that truth is kind of developing, that attitude developed over the years of Impressionism and post-Impressionism. And now we're talking about truth. And when talked about his work and people didn't understand it, he would talk about his work as being in a whole other language. In fact, he would say, I don't speak Chinese, but that doesn't mean that Chinese doesn't mean anything or that it doesn't exist. And so he's doing this, and he's taking the whole of art into a whole other direction. And I might add to this, this is where we see the idea of abstraction develop. And I think if you think about the term abstract, it means to take from something. So what Picasso here has taken is the idea and the shapes of a guitar, and he put them back together, but he's only taken what he wants out of this. He's not taking the whole thing, but abstract. Ab is to take, like abduct. If somebody kidnaps you, they abduct you. Abstract, take from, like extract or something, take something. So abstract is kind of a combination of those two Latin words. Anyway, so this is Cubism. Three musicians, 1921. This is what they would call that synthetic cubism. And let me zoom in on some of this too. He's kind of doing the same thing that he did with the guitar, and he's truly just flattened it out. It becomes much more design-like, if you will. Would you agree with that? So this musician's shirt, which is a kind of a triangular yellow-orange pattern, it's kind of reduced to a flat shape, and it's somewhat geometric. There's his hand right there, just kind of an idea of a hand. And the sheet music. And the clarinet player. And I have to get back out. I forgot what this guy's playing. Zoom in. It's too dark. I wish I could tell you. I think he may be doing percussion. Or he may be doing a keyboard. At any rate, not good light. Bottom line though, they like the newspapers, they like sheet music. They like the idea that flat things convey ideas and meaning and stuff. And so this is synthetic cubism. And so really by this time, cubism as such is kind of over. But Picasso will continue to paint for another 50 years. Now, why am I going on so much about cubism? It changed the game. It changed how people thought about art and what art could be. And so we really pushed that idea of doing away with illusionism. And so let me go there. This is another one. And this one, who wrote about this? Natalie. Natalie mentioned this as a very hard to understand art book. I'm going to ask you a question, quiz 3. So let me begin by showing you some other slides about Guernica. And here is Picasso in this studio space. And here is the canvas. You will see what the dimensions are. 11.5 feet high, 25.5 feet wide. So it's huge. It's epic. It's gigantic. And here he is working on it. You can see he had to use a ladder to paint some of this because it was so big. And here is this painting, an early stage of completion. So why do we have these pictures? Partly because Picasso was the most famous artist in the entire world at the time. As a matter of fact, he was so famous, he stayed in France during World War II because he was so famous, the Nazis wouldn't even go near him. They just let him be. He just stayed in France. They didn't want anything to do with Picasso, although they were ideologically very much against him and his artwork and all this other stuff. But he was a world figure. He was known all over the world. And so when he painted this was like quite a big event. And if you go online, you can see all different kinds of photos of this painting in various stages of completion. So what is this about? Guernica, it's a town in France. You see the date on this, 1937. This was in the middle of the Spanish Civil War. And it was a civil war that actually had 3 sides. They had a democratic side, which was kind of one of the big armies. And then they had the fascist side, which was kind of like the Nazis. It was a guy named Franco who was a dictator, became a dictator, and he remained in power for like 40 years after this war. He won the war, by the way. And then the third side was the communists, and they wanted to bring in communism. So it was a three-way fight. But Franco had the connections. Because he was a fascist, because he was a dictator, he became aligned with Hitler, who was in power in Germany. This is right before the Second World War begins in Europe 2 years later. But bottom line is that the Nazis are developing all kinds of new weapons. Dive bombers, various kinds of destructive power. And so they let Franco have all of this stuff. That's how he won the war. But these weapons that the Nazis developed were extremely lethal, very destructive. If I could go on, there's a parallel to all of this right now in Ukraine. Mariupol, the city has been flattened by Russian rockets, aerial bombardment, artillery, etc. This is what Mariupol looks like. Guernica looked like that in 1937. And so to protest this civil war in Spain, Picasso's home country, he did this painting. And he did it and let people know he was doing it while he was doing it. So Life magazine was there taking pictures. People were seeing this all over the world. Picasso's grand painting. Now, what he was doing was using a lot of the style, the Cubist elements that he had developed 20 years before this, in the 19 teens, where we were talking about cubism, analytic and synthetic. And so that accounts for the way all of these things are drawn. The idea of fragmenting images and putting them back together oftentimes led to the idea that you could see two sides of a single face. For instance, something like this. Again, here, one eye looking forward, the other. Putting the images back together. This was his style. And he was famous. Of course, it's done, again, achromatic, no color. It's his epic anti-war painting. And it's been seen as such since the time it was created. As a matter of fact, what you see, it's in the National Museum in Madrid, which is Spain. But while Franco was still in power, he would not allow that painting to go to Spain. Just a little bit of background here. Actually, and this has been shown on display at places like the United Nations. So it becomes this 20th century's anti-war symbol. I want to zoom in on another little part of this, if you will. This stuff right here. One of the things that the Cubist Rock and Picasso liked to do was to take newspaper and glue it onto the surface. Well, you see, this painting is so scaled up that newspaper would work in a much different sort of way. So he kind of mimics, scales up newspapers. So that's really what this alludes to. Newspaper. Of course, it's gigantic, and instead of having actual letters and information, it has some of the basic elements. And so that is Guernica. And it says National Museum in Madrid. Actually, the poster I have it at the Prado. Anyway, so Picasso. This is, let me show you, I got some more Picasso stuff. The painting, Girl Before a Mirror by Pablo Picasso, is one of the masterpieces of Cubism. It was completed in 1932 and been interpreted, in many ways by the critics as well as the art fanatics. Again, one of those ways that it's critiqued or interpreted is from a feminist point of view. And Picasso, in his lifetime, had many mistresses, and he had many children with these women. And some of these women he would have a long relationship with, some not so much. But as I just told you, we lived to be very, very old. And he had a lot of kids. And it was kind of a weird thing. My art history teacher back in the day said that Picasso was one of these guys that loved children. He always liked having children around him. But he didn't like children when they grew up. So then he would move on and have some more children, and the other ones would go away. Stuff. And so Marie-Therese Walter, the mistress of Pablo Picasso, but there's a lot of them. In fact, there's a movie, you could probably get it on Netflix, it's called Surviving Picasso. And I forgot which one it is. It's a woman who was one of his mistresses in the 1940s, after Marie-Therese Walter. There was another one famously, Dora Maar, M-A-R. Anyway, it's a movie about her and her relationship with Picasso. And it's kind of really cool because Picasso is played by, I just saw him the other night. Anthony Hopkins, the guy who does Hannibal Lecter, He was at the Academy Awards. Anyway, bottom line, he does a brilliant job of portraying Picasso. And this brings in a whole other level of interpretation about art. And that is trying to understand the life of the artist so that you can understand the art. And it starts really with, for me anyway, Van Gogh. Kind of after the fact, because when he died, he was basically unknown. But years after his death, they published the letters he had written to his brother, who was his closest confidant and financier. And so we have this, what is essentially a journal of his creative life in his letters to Theo. Book actually mentioned. But the idea of interpreting art by looking at the life of the artist. And that really happens in a big way with Picasso. And I don't know that before this time anybody ever looked at the lives of the artists so much. And we've kind of retrofit some of that with people like Leonardo da Vinci, looking at his life, what we can put together. But Picasso in his lifetime was center stage. He was very public. He was the guy who was the epitome of the modern artist. And if I could, back 100 years ago, generally there would be one person that, for whatever reason, kind of came to represent an entire field or discipline, at least to the public. And so that happened in the 50s. Rock and roll. Elvis Presley, he was the big name. But in other areas, if we were to talk about physics in the first half of the 20th century, you'd be talking Einstein. And he would be the only one that anybody ever knew anything about. There were a lot of brilliant physicists working at the time alongside Einstein, but Einstein became the prototype. He was the guy that his hair was all disheveled. He was the guy that, at least in folklore, forgot how to tie a shoe, but understood the universe. Picasso, eccentric, the eccentric artist, the guy who is just so genius, he's like way above all the rest of us. And so anyway, there are people like that. And we still kind of look at society that way too, I think. If you were to talk about the cosmos, 50 years ago, you'd be talking Carl Sagan. And if you were talking about astrophysics, Stephen Hawking. Or if you were talking about astronomy today, Neil deGrasse Tyson today. It's like these people. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. I want to bring you back to this artwork. As I said earlier, Cubism allowed the artist to create an image, in this case, a portrait, where you see the face in profile and you see the face straight on. If you take a look at how this is put together, you see the pink side here. That is a profile. You incorporate the yellow side here, is full frontal portrait. And so, as I was showing you before, the idea of patterning, the three musicians, all of that is here. And there are people that analyze this, saying this girl before a mirror is actually a self-portrait. I don't know. You want to take a think about that. There are some people that say all art is a self-portrait in its own way. Here's a Picasso that's at the St. Louis Art Museum. Yeah, 1881, 1973. So take 19, add that on to here. 92. 92 years old. Picture and fruit bowl. There's something else going on here. This is where Picasso kind of starts to see influences from other artists of his day. And that is how these lines are put together. We already know about how he takes little bits and pieces, fragments of images, and they represent the whole. And sometimes you see one object from two points of view simultaneously. But this is a result of what they call automatic drawing. And that is where you take something to make marks with. A piece of charcoal, a pencil, in this day and age, a Sharpie or something. And what you do is pretty much clear your mind of conscious thought. I don't have anything to make a mark with, but so I'll demonstrate. Just a minute. Where you clear your mind and just start move where the spirit takes you. Automatic drawing. Just freeform. Not trying to make an image, just making what's going through your mind. That was a big thing in the 1930s. This is going to lead to something we'll talk about on Wednesday. Surrealism. He was interested in surrealist techniques. And one of the things that some surrealists employed was automatic drawing. And I'll show you one of those here. This is Miro, roughly the same time. This is 1933. And he's considered a surrealist, and these shapes are created through the use of automatic drawing. As a matter of fact, he'd stand before a canvas, and sometimes he'd paint blocks of color or something as a ground. But then he'd draw over the top of this, and then he would come back and fill in some of the spaces that were created through the use of automatic drawing. Can you see that here? Picasso was interested in fact, Picasso will spend the last 50 years of his life kind of doing a lot of different things from one time to the next. He's the guy who kind of fits in with neoclassicism for a while and surrealism for a while and so on. But automatic drawing, that's how he gets there. And why would that be surrealism? I'll have to explain that when we talk surrealism. But this is that painting I showed you. And here's some more. Let me make sure I got the screen right. Yeah, we'll be. So this is the website, St. Louis Art Museum. And as you can see, they got a room of Picasso. This was in a side gallery. At any rate. Let's Cubism. Cubism influenced a lot of things. It was like the big deal of the day. Alexander Archipenko, woman combing her hair. Now take a look at this. This is her arm. This is her hair. Where's her head? That's exactly it. So negative space can be a positive shape. And that is exactly what's going on here. And I want to kind of point out that a lot of this stuff here, that automatic drawing, when you're talking about the sculpture, you would think that when Archipenko was putting this together, he probably thought about this, put together a maquette based on a drawing that may have had been inspired. But at any rate, the idea of a negative shape and a positive space happens all the time in Cubism. Jack Lipschitz, Bather, and this is kind of a hard to see, but bottom line is that this is put into somewhat quasi-geometric shapes. Take apart the subject matter, put it into blockish kind of shapes, cast it, and again, Cubist inspired. Julio Gonzalez, woman combing her hair. And this kind of fits in that same way. You can see this is kind of her from behind, but basically taking reality and abstracting from it what you will, what the artist would like you to see, and leaving all the rest behind. And some other ideas that come out of Cubism. Robert Delaunay, Homage to Blériot. And instead of taking apart the subject matter, which they do, you see the Eiffel Tower, you see this old airplane, you see a propeller, you see some other little bits and fragments of a wheel or stuff. Mostly what you're seeing here are circles. And something of a rainbow spectrum, but not exactly. Well, where the Cubists were not interested, at least for a while, in color, they were saying that color was in its own way kind of a distraction. People like Delaunay said, no, we can take color apart and put it back together on the canvas. And so you get these kind of rainbow effects, and we'll talk about light as being circular. This is called Orphic Cubism. And so you take everything apart, put it back together, get little bits and pieces. And so you guys got an idea who Blériot was? Just by looking at the painting. Okay, I give up. I'll tell you. He was a French aviator, a French pioneer aviator back when airplanes looked like this, more like the Wright brothers than anything else. He was a French aviator, and he was the first aviator to cross the English Channel in an airplane. And that's before World War I, but just barely. And you can see the propeller, the idea of the Eiffel Tower, which came to symbolize France. He was a national hero. Only that 13 years later, we would see Charles Lindbergh fly the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic Ocean, but the technology developed rapidly, partly due to the First World War, but bottom line is that that was his status. That's who he was. And it was all this Orphic Cubism and so on. There's another Delaunay, Champ de Mars, the Red Tower. And you see, it's a depiction of the Eiffel Tower in red, and it is. It's taking the buildings apart, flattening them out. Again, kind of like analytic cubism, but reincorporating color. Again, this is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And then another guy who actually picks up on some of these ideas, Ferdinand Ligier. And again, he takes everything apart, puts it back together. But what Ligier did, he was kind of more interested in industry. He was kind of more interested in factories and industry and stuff like that. So we have some humans here, but they actually look kind of like automatons, like robots. Mind you, this is 100 years ago. But you see all of this scaffolding, all of these signs and symbols, all taken apart, put back together in a composition. And the idea of this being the city. Now there's a film, you can see this on YouTube that kind of corresponds to this. It's Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Now, these ideas are not just in painting, they are in philosophy, they are in social sciences, they're actually in cinema as well. And what you have here too, instead of taking newspapers as the Cubists were so inclined, he's taking actually signs found in the city and putting them, chopping them up, fragmenting them, putting them back together. Here's another DJ. Again, it's a classic Western art, 3 nudes, but in something of a cold and calculated depiction using some of the techniques of Cubism. The idea being patterning, flatness, right out of there. But again, not that agitated brushwork and stuff that we see coming out of the Cubists. Oh, there's that Metropolis. That's what I was talking about. Fritz Lang. You can see this on YouTube. 1927. Silent movie. And futurism. The rest of these here, like Delaunay and the sculpture and stuff, they were all kind of considered Cubist inspired. They're using some of the techniques popular at this time. When we come back on Wednesday, we'll talk about futurism. And it too is an offshoot of Cubism, but put to a different kind of subject, a different, and in some ways considered a political mode or end. And so, any questions from you guys? I've been talking a lot. No? How about you guys at home? Huh? Well, in that case, I'll see you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
That'll be a wrap. And